So I have the church's first aid kit here. Looking at the back of it, it reminds me of ads that used to be on the back of sporting good magazines. 200 pieces of fishing equipment. Of course, 150 of those were little hooks. But so this is a first aid kit. And how many of you have a first aid kit in your home? Hope you all do, and should have one probably in your car as well. So what kinds of things do you use a first aid kit for? Cuts, burns, abrasions. What was that? Sprain. You might have a wrap in there. Heart surgery. Yeah, appendicitis. I bet Zach would have some interesting things in his first aid kit that we wouldn't. I actually have sutures in my first aid kit, and got some other things in there that for serious situations. I built a first aid kit to take on construction teams overseas, so there's some creative things in there. But nevertheless, first aid kit's a great thing to have, and there are lots of good uses for it. How many of you have a first aid kit for your emotions? Yeah. All right. The wine cabinet. So this morning, I'm going to begin a series with you talking about things to use to stock up your emotional medicine cabinet. And this morning, I'm going to talk about how to deal with failure. And I'm doing that this morning because we're about halfway through Lent. And typically about this time, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later, people experience failure in things that they set out to do in Lent and were unsuccessful. So I want to talk to you about what to do with the failures of your life. And to do that, I want to look at an individual who actually we've talked about in relationship to this already, and that's Peter. And I'm going to be reading from John. I don't know if you'll be able to keep up with me because I'm kind of jumping through several things, but you can turn to John if you'd like, and I'm looking at 20 and 21. So, you know, the huge failure that happened to Peter, it was the fact that he denied Jesus. But what actually made it even worse was that when Jesus told him that it was going to happen, he said, that'll never happen to me. So he set himself up, and sometimes that is the worst part of failure, when we're so sure that this time we'll succeed. This is the one time I'm going to launch into this new discipline, this exercise program, this dieting program, this scripture reading program, and I won't fail. And then we fail. And so Peter is in that situation where he was positive that he would, to the death, defend Jesus, and he didn't. And so this is actually after that. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and she saw the stone that had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the stripes of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. And then jumping down, in verse 21, it says, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus took some bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I do love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." So I was thinking about Peter and how he would have felt after all of this. And I can imagine him running to the tomb and going inside there, and the first thing in his mind, or what I would imagine in his mind, is he's saying, "Oh, please, dear God, make this all disappear. Make it, if there's any way that we can go back and redo this, if there's any way that we could make this go back in time and have this failure not happen, please, God." And then the second thing I imagine him doing is talking to himself. Before Christmas, I was working on excuse me just a minute. I was working on a project, making a gift for somebody, and I was right at the very end. I just had to make one more cut. So I set the table saw all up, got it all ready to go, slid the piece through, and then realized I'd cut the wrong side. I needed to just simply flip it. All I had to do was flip it and run it through that way. It would have been perfect, but it was completely ruined. So I started this dialogue with myself. Do you know how that dialogue goes? "What an idiot. I can't believe I did that. That is so stupid. Why would I do that? All that work just wasted." Constantly telling myself what a horrible job I'd done and what a horrible mistake. So the very first thing that often happens in the midst of our failure is that we start a dialogue with ourselves. And, you know, when I was a small child, one of the things that my mother stressed to me is to speak kindly to people. I'm sure that your parents did that with you as well. You learn as a child to speak kindly to each other. But we don't often practice the same behavior when we're talking to ourselves. It is so easy to not be kind to ourselves, to be brutal, to be cruel, and to call ourselves names and to accuse ourselves of lack of intelligence or lack of skill or lack of discipline or whatever. So it's very easy for us to berate ourselves. And I can imagine Peter going through that motion of just berating himself for his lack of courage, for his lack of ability, for his lack of tenacity to stick to what it was. So the first principle that I want you to put in your emotional toolbox is that you need to learn to speak to yourself kindly, and that you need to speak to yourself respectfully. And you are a child of God. God made you, and you deserve to speak to yourself in a way that's respectful and kind. You also need to evaluate yourself properly. I was working on some siding with a friend one year, and we just started the morning, and I was way up on some scaffolding, and he was cutting the boards down below. And I would measure them and call the dimensions down, and he would throw the boards up to me, and I would nail them on. So I remember the first measurement, I gave it to him, and he pitched the board up. I put it up, and it was too long. And I dropped it back down, and I said, "This board's it's just a little too long." So he trimmed it off, threw it back up. I nailed it up, measured the next one, told him what I wanted. He threw it back up. I passed it back, and I said, "This one's too long too," kind of smiling. Third board, too long as well. And by about the fourth or fifth board, we were starting to look at each other. You know that look? And he looked at me for a minute and he said, "Throw me your tape measure." So I threw my tape measure back down to him. We both had brand new tape measures. He stretched them out on his cutting board and they were an eighth of an inch different. So we weren't using the same measurement, the same tool to evaluate what we truly need to accomplish. And that's so true of ourselves. We tend to not evaluate ourselves correctly. It's important for you to remember that the very first race of your life, you were competing with around 100 million other potential humans, and you won that race. You're the only one. Nobody else did. 100 million. Another thing to remember about yourself is, how many people have ever lived on the planet? You probably know, Tim. 100 billion? Yeah. You know what? 100 billion people? There has never been another human like you. There never has. You are created unique. God said that he put you together to be uniquely you. And it's so easy to compare ourselves to everyone else and say, yeah, I don't look like them. I'm not built like them. I'm inferior to them. I don't have that same intelligence. I don't have the same disciplines. But you know what? They didn't live your life. They didn't have your parents. They weren't raised in the same family. They didn't go to the same school. They weren't perhaps even in the same church. There's so many things that make you uniquely you that no other person that's ever walked on this planet has walked. And when you berate yourself for failing in a certain place because someone else succeeded and you didn't, you're failing to take into consideration that those other people that succeeded where you failed didn't live your life. And again, you need to be kind to yourself. And you need to appreciate for who you are. Psychologists say that one of the hardest things about failure is it tends to make us not to want to try again. And failure, rather than being something which sets us back, really should be something which promotes us to try again. But that's not typically what happens. People that fail tend, if they continue to fail, they tend to give up. So in addition to evaluating yourself, you need to evaluate truly what failure is, because failure is simply an opportunity to see who you are and to learn more about yourself and to discover why. Why was it at this point that I wasn't able to go on? Or why was it at this point that I was afraid, or I lacked courage, or didn't have the discipline? And what is it that would allow me to build things into my life to make me next time succeed? One of the next things that Peter does that I love is that he treats himself well by doing something that he loves to do, something that he knows he is generally successful at, going fishing. Turns out he isn't successful in that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's what he decides. I need to go put something in my life that I typically succeed at. So oftentimes, something that really helps in the midst of failure is to find something that you do well and to just do that for a bit. And to just reinforce yourself that you do have incredible talents. You do have incredible abilities. You have things that no one else that on this planet has ever had. And so Peter goes out and goes fishing. And I love that fact that he does. And the other thing that Peter does is he involves people, because we are communal beings. And we succeed better in community than we do on our own. And one of the things that I encouraged you when we first started this walk through Lent is to tell someone what your journey is going to be, to sort of help somebody, give somebody else permission to help you, to encourage you, and to maybe call you every day and say, hey, how did it go today? Well, it didn't work. Well, let's just start again tomorrow. It doesn't have to be every single day of Lent. Let's start again tomorrow. We'll try it between now and Easter. It didn't work. You went this far and then stopped. That's all right. We'll start again tomorrow, and we'll see how far it goes. And so friends are so helpful in helping us to have a true picture of ourselves too, aren't they? I mean, sometimes friends see value in us that it's very difficult for us to see in ourselves. And sometimes people love us and we think, why in the world does that person love me? Because I don't love myself very well at all. The next thing that's fascinating to me in this whole journey of Peter's failure is what responsibility Christ gave him next after this. Of all the disciples, Peter's the one that failed the worst. The other ones ran away, but Peter literally stayed there and actually literally denied him. And so I'm sure that at least Peter feels like his failure is the worst. And yet, he is the very one that Jesus entrusts with feeding his sheep. And so he gives him this responsibility to not only grow through this, but to grow into other people's lives. So God saw Peter's failure as a tool that he could use. And we often see our failures as something which is horrible and which is a detriment to us. But Jesus saw that failure as something which contributed something to Peter's life. There was value in that. And we need to be able to see the value in those times that we don't succeed. It's fascinating also to me that the role that Peter was given was to love people. And you know, in order to love people, you really have to be able to love yourself. You will never be able to love people adequately until you have learned to truly love yourself. And that's an important, significant journey that every one of us is constantly going down and will be going down probably till the day that we die. And there's sort of a warped idea in the church that loving yourself is self-centeredness or is egotistical. But those traits of being egocentric and narcissistic are actually evidences of people that don't love themselves very well. Because people that love themselves well have a very balanced view of themselves. They understand their weaknesses, they understand their strengths, and they grow to like who they are. And that should be a goal for every single one of us. And as we grow to like who we are, it is much easier for us to like other people, in spite of the facts that they've failed, and to see beyond their failures and to love them for who they truly are. Because they won that 100 million race too. The last thing that is so important to put into your toolbox in getting past failure is to understand that we are doing this in relationship to God. It's not just in our own human efforts. Jesus said that he is sharing the yoke of life with us, that he is walking with us, that he is struggling through those things with us. I think it's so fascinating that they're out there in the boat and they have caught nothing. And then Jesus comes and makes their effort. What they wanted to accomplish was to have some positive thing happen after the failures, after the disappointments of the crucifixion. And that happened because of Jesus. He's the one that caused them to catch those fish. And the result beyond that was the sweet communion on the shore with Jesus, with fish, and probably some bread. So I want to encourage you, if you've ever failed in your life, when you fail again in your life, to start putting things in your first aid kit right now, to start preparing yourself for failure, to start seeing failure as opportunities, not simply as the end of the road, but as the beginning of a new chapter in a different direction. Seeing failure as something which reveals something about yourself. If you're chronically failing in the same area, you know, there's probably things back early in your life that are a reason for that. The other thing I think to realize is that, you know what, there are some journeys that we feel like we need to walk down that God doesn't really care about, that society imposed on us, or that somehow we feel because of society we need to walk down this journey. Make sure that the journey or the tasks that you're asking yourself to do are ones that God gave you, not that other people gave you. So evaluate those things. Make sure you're doing the ones that God wants. So learn about yourself, grow in your relationship to God, and understand that we are all beings that are going to be failing constantly between now and eternity. And it's part of who we are as humans. Stand with me and let me just offer a benediction for you.